and the discussion is taking place as part of FAIL Football 2021. So the first thing I'm going to do is hand you over to Cara New. Chairperson for today is Emer Mcnulty, who is a history student at Queen's University of Belfast, and is also an activist within Haram Jarek and the campaign for Lynn Angry Race at Queen's University of Belfast. So, can I hand you over to Emer Mcnulty?
So, culture over to a new UK partnership at aggregate for Mona Marco Stava School, especially Aranu. Because of my education school, Squash, Rudy, Dora, and Dini, a salary, always a play, and Kenyan Toby, and Harry, Marco Stava. Hashan Hawat will it was public of the break, learning this, the national show of the school session. Of this new judgment on country was in Apple, Illinois, or Polish line. And Mark Hasselbein is even of the break, Italian college, from more Queen Bastacha, and the ocean, and Staborisha, others, and Syriza. Because it's like how COVID, it was dark time, so we just also doing squad security, today it got from me were critical, around Kindle Tohi and one which Coney, obviously salary and daughter of Edgerton Tohi is far certified. And this community mean the Dini is Gomin Emeritus Obvious and Narachmish, a Gavi Parta, as an energy and general of Garkin and on Frastel or as a real machine. And anyone will look at a chocolate, obviously College, obviously Bullshit, Martinil, and a Winchester as well. Mention of the words and Bubble and Mention, obviously with Jarfa, Kaharki, and Marcus and Kenil, Wanya, obviously ask the page, it will be the LA and Toby Kaharka, and Fountain. So, Northern Women's new community education program, exciting area new, liberty, equality, solidarity, aims to facilitate an inclusive and participatory grassroots discussion on the new Ireland that will be imagined, debated, campaigned, and fought for in the time ahead. It is our belief that this urgent discussion should merely be the serve of political elites and political parties, but must rather be initiated through critical engagement in working class communities who have borne the brunt of two failed political states in Ireland. The COVID crisis has opened a unique space for critical reflection in which utopian ideas can be discussed and engaged with in understanding that we can and should find alternative ways of being and organising society in a fairer and more sustainable way. So the title of this event is Ethnic Cleansing, the Irish War of Independence between 1919 and 1923, and academic interpretations and responses. Therefore, the focus of this event will be that after 1980, the national struggle for independence in the 1920s was reinterpreted as a sectarian conflict. Presented by academic historians, new evidence confirmed that unremembered sectarian conflict raged across Southern Ireland, leading to the ethnic cleansing of Protestants. This panel discusses how and why this new narrative emerged without verifiable evidence. All of the panelists are experts in the field and in their different ways critical of the prevailing historical consensus, sometimes known as revisionism, but perhaps more accurately identified as a counterinsurgency historiography directed against republicanism. We'll have with us today Fergal McCluskey, who is a lecturer in history at St Mary's University College, Belfast. Niall Meehan is the head of journalism at Berkeley College. Barry King is a respected teacher of history and published independent scholar, and John Regan teaches history at the University of Dundee. So is Eddie Kitchell and Faye New, Nana Granny Etchna, Coggy is a DJ, or it's DJ DJ3, Nadeo Akadilla, or it's a Fragmentary Akadilla Law. So, Dario and Play are in Treasure and DJ Octo, Nurani Amadeo, which Dr. Snatchinga, or Son of Sirsha, and DJ Fiji, Mark Irvin Chapaka. Yorki Finish and New, Arna Kurlacher, Sarda Akadilla, Kurlach, Ellie
kind of unusually for his historical talk. It centred on an ahistorical event, something that didn't happen, which was the ethnic cleansing of Southern Protestants in the early 1920s. And that was framed within an ethnic conflict that didn't happen either. So that's the non-event that we're discussing. And I want to discuss that around three ideas, three concepts. The first being historical agency, which is the first thing I'm going to talk about. I'll move on and discuss the construction of the ethnic cleansing and the ethnic conflict narratives and how that has been endorsed by historians as a validated historical interpretation. And then towards the end of this talk, I want to get onto this subject of our counterinsurgency historiography, which I think begins to help explain how non-events, ahistorical non-events, become part of the Academy's history of the so-called Irish Revolution. So let's get started with historical agency. This is a very, very powerful concept inside the Academy. The idea that historical ideas, historical information, can lead to direct political action. The idea that history books have a connection, a relationship with acts of terror, effectively. And those of you that remember the utterings of the late Conor Cruise O'Brien will remember his explanation of the Troubles was that it all started because the ghosts of 1916 were resurrected in 1966 in Northern Ireland. And that explained the emergence of the crisis here. Not partition, discrimination, not Unionist misrule, the bittersweet legacy of colonialism, but commemoration, historical narrative. That's a very, very powerful concept. And so nothing that I'm going to say in the next few minutes will make sense unless we understand that's deeply embedded within the Academy, that the wrong histories cost lives. And you can put a lot of pressure on people in terms of applying that argument to them, that by writing the wrong history, you're actually supporting terrorism, fellow traveller. Some of this language is very familiar to anybody who has followed the debates, historiographical debates in the last few years. Now, the ethnic cleansing narrative and the ethnic conflict thesis was developed in the 1990s by the Canadian-born historian Peter Hart, some of whom actually have been taught, some of the people in this room have been taught by Peter. And he developed this in his 1992 doctoral thesis, and then went on to publish articles and a book, The IRA and Its Enemies, which endorsed this concept. Many of us were all very sceptical about Peter's take on this, because nobody remembered the ethnic conflict or the ethnic cleansing. And no historian writing before the 1990s on this period touched upon any evidence relating to this brave new revisionist interpretation. And that was strange. But it was also part of Peter's innovation and the brave new historiography that he was bringing to the table. There were many debates around Peter's work, which Neil, Meehan, myself were involved in, very often distracting us from the major issue, which was identified by Barry Keane, who will speak in a few moments, in 2012. Barry went through the census material for West Cork, excluded the non-native Protestants, and could find no evidence of a mass exodus or mass depopulation amongst the Protestant community. And the game was up. We didn't realise it at the time, but Barry's intervention was the most important intervention in the whole Hart debate. There followed a flurry of articles. Andy Bieleberg had been working on this problem for years. He published the next year. He estimated most 16,000, estimated, or at least 2,000 Protestants might have possibly, plausibly was the word used, have been excluded or forced out, but he wasn't counting heads. Then David Fitzpatrick, Hart's supervisor, published 2 papers in 2013, 2014, and he worked, and again, similar model to Barry, counting heads using the Methodist census, which is a very accurate annual census of populations. No ethnic cleansing, no forced migration. So where was the ethnic conflict? 2014, I visited Hart's the archives Peter used in Dublin, West Cork, Cork City, Belfast, and Dublin, and counted all of the databases that he worked on. And he miscalculated or misrepresented all of the data sets. However, and this is the interesting aspect of the ethnic conflict thesis, all of the data sets, though miscalculated or misrepresented, identify a mass Protestant exodus in 1922, 1920, 22, 23. So, there was no ethnic cleansing, we all agree. There was no, and is no evidence of ethnic conflict emanating within the Republican movement. And we know this partly because other historians have come on after Hart and developed his thesis in a book-length study, for example, Gemma Clark's 2014 book, Everyday Violence in the Irish Civil War. Now, Clark surveyed 2,000 compensation files in British and Irish archives, which were made by loyalists after the conflict. No evidence of a single Protestant, with one possible exception, being evicted under sectarian threat by the IRA. Hart surveyed 700 files for County Cork, so he said. No evidence, no direct evidence. There's anecdotal evidence, there's evidence attributed to the IRA. He attributes a pernicious language of exclusion and prejudice to the IRA, but there's no evidence of this that I found. Now, it may come to the surface in the future. Ireland was a sectarian society, and there was some sectarian violence in society at this time, particularly in the city of Belfast. No question about that. But elsewhere in the south, far less so. Now, I said there was one exception in terms of Clark's research, and that's Ada Vere Hunt in Cashel in County Tipperary. And according to Gemma Clark's study, Ada Vere Hunt was evicted by rebel Republicans, the IRA, she's quite vague about this, in 1922. But what Clark doesn't tell you is that Ada Clark, who was of course Protestant, was also an IRA spy, and a very effective IRA spy, and enjoyed the protection of the Irish Republican Army, incidentally. But that little nugget of information is missing from Clark's critique. So, how does a non-history become a PhD, become an Oxford University monograph? How is it then developed within the academy into more and more studies referencing Hart's work, referencing this ethnic conflict, when in fact there is, to date, no evidence? So we have to go back to the early 1970s and the response of historians to the outbreak of the troubles here, the so-called troubles here, Civil War here. And there was a response from some historians that advocated what we in the academy call an applied history. We apply history to a problem, and they wanted to apply Irish history to undermining the nationalist physical force tradition and the Republican tradition. This was beaten down in the early 70s by the old founding father revisionists, Theo Mooney Trinity, Robert W. Evans at UCD as far as I know, and FSL Lyons at Canterbury, who later came back as Provost Trinity in 74. They refused to have the academy hijacked for a political purpose. And Lyons held the line against the counterinsurgency historiography until his premature death at the age of 60 in September 1983. Then the direction of the historical community was up for grabs. The counterinsurgency historians began to take the high ground, and they were backed from within the government, notably by the then Taoiseach, Dr. Gareth Fitzgerald, who had some influence in the appointment of Professor William Fanning to the chair of history at UCD. What I'm suggesting here is that there's nothing secret about counterinsurgency historiography. It's in the newspapers, it was part of lectures, it is completely in the open. And what the historians did, effectively, although they're in deep denial of this, was abandon what we call historical method, historical research, or scholarly revision. History that tends to be balanced, to represent the country narrow-minded, reductive narratives. They abandon that in favour of historiography, the organising principle which was the association of negative historical values with republicanism in the hope that they would undermine modern political republicanism, both physical force and militant, as well as civic republicanism. And so, anti-democracy, sectarianism, ethnic violence, sexual violence, these narratives were associated with republicanism in the literature that emerged from the 1980s, mid-80s onwards, and Hartz is the classic example of this. What it has produced is an ahistorical non-history, that is to say, history that can be traced to the archives and have no remote reality or existence in historical reality and historical experience. And I think some of those issues may be developed in the next few minutes. Thank you very much.
So if John talked about our history on a macro level, I'm going to address it on a micro level. So I will suggest that revisionist history is attempted to distort the record in order to conform to ideological divisions. One is that the IRA was sectarian and anti-Protestant during the War of Independence, as John mentioned. Fergal McGarry from Queen's University disagrees. He recently observed that revisionist accounts incorporate wider strands of sectarian, agrarian and intra-communal conflict, more so than allegedly simplistic nationalist narratives. He analysed the April 1921 killing in Monaghan of Kate Carroll, one of 3 women the IRA executed during the 1990-21 period, from a total of just under 200. McGarry and others suggested that Carroll was killed by the IRA for sectarian reasons, because she was poor, because she made poaching, and because of a failed relationship. As revisionist historians assert that the IRA targeted and oppressed marginalised groups, Carroll's death was discussed in that context. In this vein, the late Professor David Fitzpatrick referred to a Republican terrorism, which sought vengeance against detested groups, including, as he put it, most contentiously Protestants. Fitzpatrick, doctoral student, the late Mr. Hart agreed, as John mentioned. He wrote in 1993 of the IRA targeting Protestants, unmarried mothers and mixed marriage couples. In 1996 he wrote of campaigns in Munster and South Leinster of what might be termed ethnic cleansing. Not to be outdone, Fitzpatrick added homosexuals and divorced people in 1998. Parts of the IRA and Kennedy Thatcher attended prostitutes and Jews. This so-called hidden history resembled a left-liberal critique of a narrow-minded reactionary view of the IRA. As Kevin Myers put it, IRA morality police initiated what the newly independent Irish state later institutionalised. Like a lot of the war historiography, revisionist historians' claims suffered evidential shortcomings. Taylor's research demonstrated that those who served in World War I were not IRA targets. Actually, the IRA valued their military expertise. Nationalist service personnel had to be demobilised quickly due to perceived Sinn Féin sympathies. Having achieved soundbite status, evidenceless claims that the IRA systematically attacked the other groups I just mentioned were silently abandoned. That left the, as David Fitzpatrick admitted, contentious view that Protestants per se were targeted. Southern Ireland's relatively small and prosperous Protestant population opposed partition and said Ulster Unionists had betrayed them. Many refuted claims that they were mistreated and criticised Unionists for killing Northern Roman Catholics. Protestant communities also retained a significant Republican tradition, as detailed in Martin Maguire's research and in Rebel Prods by the late Valerie Jones. If the IRA systematically targeted Protestants, that would have been impossible, but not for revisionist historians who targeted Protestants as IRA victims, an approach reinforced in analysis of the death of Kate Carroll. This case study illustrates what happens when such research is left to its own largely unscrutinised devices. An incident was deemed symptomatic of IRA sectarianism and was repeated in one historical account after another. A major error in the research was effectively buried, while others lingered on. Critical self-reflection, something nationalists are encouraged to do, is not for revisionists. So let us begin. 4 times up to the year 2000, Professor Terence Dooley of Maynooth University accused the IRA of involvement in callous sectarian crimes. The rank and file where he said, obsessed with ancient grievances and murdered a middle-aged female Protestant spinster named Kate Carroll. Dooley said that Kate Carroll was killed in defiance of an IRA order specifying that female spies be warned and not shot. IRA used war as what they liked, thought Dooley, dictated by a desire to exact revenge at a local level. Dooley was the first historian to research 1960s Monaghan IRA veteran testimonies in the Marron collection. Though some veterans spoke about Kate Carroll's death, Dooley did not cite them. Instead, he relied on his own speculations and on the Northern Standard newspaper account. It produced propaganda from the seat of British administration in Dublin Castle. Now, Dooley claimed that Carroll's execution was sectarian, despite also stating that the IRA suspected her of informing. This problem is resolved by asserting that Carroll's religion fueled or over-determined IRA suspicion. In this vein, Fergal McGarry's 2005 biography of Monaghan IRA leader, later of Fine Gael and the Blue Shirts, Eoin O'Duffy, promoted a new twist: sectarianism combined with puritanical opposition to illegally distilled poaching. Kitty Carroll was, said McGarry, a person of no social consequence, a middle-aged Protestant spinster who made whiskey. He surmised, the charge of spying appears to have been a convenient rationale for the execution of an obvious and antisocial security risk. In other words, Carroll's religion, illegal distilling, and unmarried status were causal factors. McGarry agreed with Dooley that Carroll's execution was based on a desire to exact sectarian revenge. McGarry also characterised as inevitably sectarian IRA clashes with Monaghan's armed loyalist forces. That was because the IRA members were primarily Roman Catholic. In an assumption that trumped evidence, McGarry agreed with Peter Hart that capital punishment is far more likely to be meted out to Protestants who provoke hostility or suspicion than to Catholic transgressors. Well, of 8 suspected spies shot in Monaghan, 1 Protestant was executed in a county with a 25% Protestant population. The third major presentation on Kate Carroll's death in 2011 spectacularly augmented her status as a marginalised sectarian victim. GCD historian Anne Dolan's account opened with 5 bullets in Kitty Carroll's body when it was found in April 2021. She said that Carroll may have informed on those IRA men who seemed intent on hounding her out of her pursued business. Dolan reported that the British Military Court of Inquiry declared that Carroll was probably suspected of disclosing information to the police with regard to local sheep-feeding activities. As the court politely put it, Carroll was a woman of feeble intellect. For a start, that is inaccurate. The British court mentioned no motive for Carroll's execution and had no view of her intellect. In fact, Dolan had no access to British Court of Inquiry records. She appears to have misread notes by Francis Hemming, secretary to the last British Chief Secretary for Ireland, Conor Greenwood. Hemming, in turn, seems to have rehashed Dublin Castle reports. These were in the Dundalk Democrat and in other newspapers and claimed that the IRA had captured anonymous letters from Carroll to the RNC about illicit drink traffic. Carroll's 80-year-old mother, Susan, not her daughter, was reported as possessing a feeble mind. Dolan did not consult the actual Democrat report. She read instead a limited Marron collection summary. I looked at it also. It concluded, note, many details missing, indeed. So having misread Hemming and misread the Castle report, Dolan took her version of the story in a new direction. She wrote, the Court of Inquiry never found out that Kitty Carroll had some notion that one of the local IRA volunteers might marry her. Dolan mused. Perhaps some fumbled promise on a dark evening had not been kept in the cold light of day, when the once amorous volunteer no longer liked what he saw. Dolan's unusual source for this IRA breach of promise was curator, Monaghan County Museum. When I contacted him, the curator had no memory of speaking to Dr. Dolan on the subject and also claimed no knowledge of Kate Carroll's love life. That should not surprise us. The curator was not alive in 1921. Dolan's discipline is, we should remind ourselves, history and not romantic fiction. One certainty qualified Dolan's ifs, buts and babies. She wrote, Carol might be a spy, she might not. There might be some personal grievance, there might not. But then, of course, she is a Protestant as well. As Dolan put it, festering under the quite sanitised surface of Irish nationalism were what may have been little more than a sequence of dirty deeds. British dirty deeds did not interest Dolan. Her article titled, Ending War in a Sportsmanlike Manner, was inspired by a British propaganda leaflet. It stated that the IRA failed to adhere to the laws and customs of war. These were drawn up and said, in order that war between white men should be carried out in a sportsmanlike manner and not like fights between savage tribes. Dolan conceded that this phraseology might seem terribly inappropriate. Brigadier General Charles Fuchs, Director of Irish Propaganda, wrote the leaflet. I looked him up. During World War I, Fuchs was Director of Poison Gas Services. Before Ireland, Fuchs was in India, where, alongside Winston Churchill, he vainly urged the use of gas against Afghan rebels. They were, he said, vermin, only fit for extermination. The troops regarded them as bloodthirsty, treacherous savages. Dolan's view of ethical conduct during wartime relied on a poison gas enthusiast with racist, imperialist and genocidal views. Carol, as a romantically spurred Protestant, then appeared in Jim McFerreter's book A Nation and Not a Rabble. Relying on Dolan, he asked rhetorically, was this really about spying? IRA testimony in the Bureau of Military History and in the Marron collection emphasised that it was really about spying. Crucial source information available in 2006 confirmed that. A historian with the information did not discuss it publicly until last October, 2 months after I did. Curiously, no IRA account mentioned Pucci. Besides that, no IRA account, or equally striking, any other cited account mentioned Carol's religion. No source that historians cited identified Carol as Protestant. There was a good reason. Kate Carroll was not Protestant. That also is a fact. There is therefore no evidence to support historians' analysis. Having mistakenly identified Carol as Protestant, they determined that alone was sufficient to confirm her death as sectarian. I mentioned crucial source information in the hands of Professor Ewan O'Halloran, GCD, based on the family connection only he had access to it. In 2006, O'Halloran spoke to an Australian Army conference on the theory and conduct of small wars and insurgencies. Speakers considered lessons learned fighting liberation forces in white minority ruled Rhodesia and South Africa. The otherwise unavailable proceedings appeared online in 2018, in fact John pointed them out. O'Halloran presented anonymised testimony from Thomas Brennan, second in command of the IRA's 5th Northern Division. It became available last year in Monaghan County Museum. Brennan's handwritten IRA notebook, composed in the 1930s, reported some very startling stories addressed to RIC military that the IRA intercepted in Monaghan Post Office. Monaghan highlighted one case in particular that gave information about where the IRA had an arms dump and where the boys stopped at night. This person, Kate Carroll, sent letters again and again to RIC Scottstown, wanting to know why these fellows were not arrested and their arms seized. Brennan reported this to Brigade OC O'Duffy. In accordance with General Order 13 on women spies, O'Duffy sent 2 men to warn Carroll to stop this at once. She denied the information. However, as Brennan pointed out, proof was forthcoming next day. Carroll wrote again to Scottstown, RIC, describing the men who had given her the warning to stop informing. Such advice to cease informing did not anticipate a recipient treated leniently on grounds of gender, informing on volunteers with relatively good news. Carroll's decision may, exceptionally, have sealed her fate. Surprisingly, after presenting Brennan's seemingly solid testimony in 2006, O'Halloran described Carroll as an alleged and unbalanced informer who had supposedly supplied what he termed semi-literate demented information. Nevertheless, O'Halloran resolved the mystery of why she was shot. It is unfortunate that historians generally and interested members of the public remained clueless until I revealed the contents of Thomas Spann's notebook in August 2020. In not giving Carol a false Protestant identity in 2006, perhaps O'Halloran was aware Carol was Catholic, perhaps. If so, that insight, in addition to Glennon's testimony, would have been good for Dooley, McGarry, O'Halloran's TCD colleague Anne Dolan, and Jim Ferreter to know. In 2015, Marie Coleman of Queen's University briefly corrected the Protestant Kate Carol mistake. She attempted to rationalise the then 29-year-old error. Dooley and McGarry, not for some reason Anne Dolan, were named in Coleman's endnotes as having mistakenly assumed that Carol was Protestant. Coleman's main text excused the error. The IRA's exceptional execution of a woman had, she wrote, led historians to question if there was a sectarian motive to Carol's killing. Now, Dooley and McGarry plus Dolan had not really questioned the sectarian motive for Carol's execution, they promoted it. Coleman here seemed to suggest that Carol's fate was more readily sealed as a Protestant rather than a Roman Catholic woman. In other words, pre-existing and arguably sectarian assumptions encouraged and excused publication of historical fiction, a historical non-event, as John mentioned. Discovering that Carol was Catholic did not stimulate a critical reappraisal. McGarry and Dooley thereafter excised Protestantism as the cause of Carol's execution. They supplanted it with Putchine and Love Gone Sour. Terence Dooley reconnected with Carol in 2017 in his book on Monaghan from 1916 to 23 with this endnote. In earlier work, I mistakenly identified Carol as a Protestant, as stated in newspaper reports at the time. Now, I looked at a lot of newspapers, none that I could see identified Carol as Protestant. Dooley did now acknowledge that 1916 to 23 witnessed a low incidence of sectarian murders in Monaghan. But rather than credit Irish Republicans' commitment to non-sectarianism, Dooley speculated that it may have been largely due to the Unionist community's ability to protect itself. Without visible evidence of much application of logic, Dooley expanded. But for IRA leader Eoin O'Duffy's restraining influence, the number of sectarian casualties would have been much higher. By extension, this suggests, I don't know how it suggests it, the rank and file were intent on sectarian violence. In other words, Dooley thought the IRA still murderously sectarian, but less successfully than he previously thought. Dooley just thus preserved his original argument with a new claim. Like McGarry, Dooley promoted a loose, contradictory definition of sectarian violence. Dooley construed as sectarian a Republican boycott of goods produced in Belfast. It was in response, he wrote, to 11,000 Catholic nationalists expelled by Unionist mobs from their jobs in Belfast in 1920, accompanied by killing 455 people. 58% of them Roman Catholic, comprising 24% of the city's overall population. Sectarian violence included expelling over 23,000 mainly Catholic people from their homes and the destruction of over 500 Catholic-owned businesses. McGarry's approach was similar. It also implied that opposition to sectarianism was itself sectarianism. While the Belfast boycott may be criticised as ineffective, it was motivated to restore to their jobs those thousands who included Protestant trade unionists expelled from their workplaces and to deter then rampant royalist violence. Dooley and McGarry have in common that they de-emphasised virulent royalist sectarianism but characterised and distorted Republican responses as sectarian. In 2018, in the Cambridge History of Ireland, Fergal McGarry returned to Kate Carroll's fate. That was after making the earlier mentioned point about revisionist accounts presenting a more complex picture of the revolution at its grassroots. Unlike Dooley, McGarry ignored his 2005 mistake, though he referenced his O'Duffy biography. Instead, he relied on another one. McGarry now claimed that more intimate factors may have contributed to Carroll's death. He cited Dermot Ferreter, who had relied on Anne Dolan's romantically rebuffed Protestant narrative. The problematic original source for Dolan's story was thereby doubly, if not triply, obscured in McGarry's repetition of Dolan's claim through Ferreter. To conclude, The evidence properly scrutinised shows that Kate Carroll was no longer competent or spurned by a volunteer who dishonoured her. She was possibly out of her depth, became an informer against the IRA and ignored warnings to desist. That does not mean she should have been executed, but it is the reason why she was executed. Historians' discussion of Kate Carroll's marginality was, curiously, never laid at the RIC's door. The force could be said to have cynically exploited a woman at the edge of the law. Their action threatened her life by encouraging her to threaten the lives and liberty of IRA volunteers. It is a thought that one revisionist historians do not entertain. Those who promoted the story of Kate Carroll, Protestant Putchie Maker, went far beyond even the limits of contemporary British propaganda. Dismissing IRA testimony while endorsing tendentious British accounts indicates collective selection bias. Revisionist history needs to be read, but treated in the same manner as historians treat their sources, critically. Remember, from the Marne collection, note, many details missing. Thank you.
Bill Knock. Stay tuned. Okay. Roy Keane of Manchester United and Ireland fame is a distant cousin of mine. As will be seen, this is important. As John has done my introduction and conclusion, this paper discusses two interlinked topics which touch on the Peter Hart War. Firstly, I would like to thank Fergal, Anya and Emer for facilitating this event, and I'm more than happy to be here. When you are not a university scholar, it can be very difficult to establish your credibility. It is a rare occasion indeed where I'm invited to discuss and be questioned about my research. I'm looking forward to the discussion and hope that you will all find it of value. But be warned, there is something polite language, so please don't be offended. In January 2020, then Irish Justice Minister Charlie Flanagan stepped on a forgotten black and tan mountain and blew his government's re-election chances to pieces. That February, Sinn Féin TV Desi Ellis sang Comanche Black and Tans to celebrate both his election and the doubling of his party's vote from 11 to 22%. As Professor Brian Walker says, Irish history matters. And because it really matters, historians of Ireland should ensure that the information they present is correct. Nowhere is this more necessary than the Peter Hart War, where no quarter is given or asked. I've already mentioned Professor Ian McBride's strange 2018 assault on John Regan's credibility and his 2019 apostle Mike Burke, which proves that the controversy has lost neither its energy nor its ritual. Only the very brave or very foolish would expect to walk through this minefield unscathed. One element of the Hart War is the statistical evidence which underpinned Hart's thesis. As we know, in 2013, the late David Fitzpatrick executed a dramatic vote fast and abandoned the key plank of his lamented former student's thesis. Unable to find evidence of significant excess native immigration, nationally or in West Cork, he rejected a Protestant exodus where almost all of the people who left did so between 1921 and 1924 in a sudden, massive upheaval. Fitzpatrick concluded that Irish minorities were good at keeping themselves warm in cold houses, observing that the spectre of Protestant extermination has distracted debate about revolutionary Ireland for too long and should be laid to rest. Shortly after, Andy Riebenberg's long-delayed exodus confirmed Fitzpatrick's research. My research made their footprints. They lasted. It might have been assumed that these articles would put an end to Hart's ethnic cleansing paradigm, but this was not the case. For example, ignoring the fact that Fitzpatrick was not sampling, but dealing with an entire community, and he was working on West Cork, where Hart had discovered a sudden massive flight in the most violent county, some reviews of Descendancy suggested that he was not convincingly extrapolating for all Protestants from the small Methodist community. Researchers still needed to be persuaded. Also in 2017, both Donald Wood and Robin Murray and Bernard Lyles launched a direct assault. In the same year, Professor Walker restated his belief
that critical for the movement of the vast majority of these people was violence arising from a number of political, economic, religious, sectarian factors which forced large numbers, approximately 40,000 in their claim, to leave. This has now been published as Southern Irish Loyalism 1912-49 and presumably has been subjected to rigorous editorial review before publication. Logically, this would mean that despite all the recent research, Hart was correct and Fitzpatrick's and the others were wrong, as the critique included my research at Cork and elsewhere. I had a vested interest in testing it. This was done chiefly by returning to the era before the Revolution, using the 1901 and 1911 online versions of the Irish Census. I was invited to present my research at the 33rd Conference of Irish Historians in 2020 with the catchy title, The Boundaries of Protestant Sects Before 1916, Abstracts from the 1901 and 1911 Census. Without going into the nitty-gritty, it has turned out that the real story is far more complex than that presented by Bury, Wood and Walker. Firstly, of the 327,000 future Free States Protestants, approximately 58,000, 55% of the decline, were directly connected with the British garrison and most probably departed with the British. The residue of the 106,000 decline is 48,000. So immediately there are questions about Bury's 40,000 involuntary departures claim. Figures simply do not add up. However, they were correct that there was significant Protestant decline in the future Free State between 1911 and 26. What they did not seem to know is that the previous 30 years, between 1881 and 1911, Protestants were suffering an increasingly dramatic decline, particularly in the south and west of Ireland. In a relatively calm period, what was the cause of this? It couldn't be the Revolution. In fact, the Revolution's effect on the rate of population decline in the south and west of Ireland was negligible. However, where there was a sudden dramatic decline was Leinster, where the vast majority of Protestants lived. This presents historians of the period with a problem. Leinster outside Dublin was by far and away the least active province in the War of Independence. Yet it not only catches up with the south and west, but surpasses it during 1126. Why in the area where they are under the least threat does the rate of native Protestant population decline increase so dramatically? Why in the supposedly most litigious areas of Protestants, according to Hart, does an already high rate not increase? Despite the fact that anyone who could have worked this out 23 years later after Hart's book was published, this is the first time that this has ever been mentioned. And this seriously upsets the revolutionary powering apple cart, doesn't it? Okay, so that was my first point. Now, being a Cork man, I am both excitable and naturally sure of my own importance. Coming from the acknowledged centre of the universe. While we are sometimes benignly tolerant of criticism from outsiders, if one of our own has a go, then nothing less than tearing down their entire house will do. Keens, in particular, have an undeserved reputation around anger management. Like all cranky Cork Keens, I am very affable until you piss me off. And this brings me neatly to Gerard Murphy's Euro Disappearances, which had identified a previously unreported campaign of disappearance and murder against up to 32 Cork Freemasons, with the anti-treaty IRA were in charge of the city between March and August 2022. As it perfectly fitted their promoted narrative, Murphy's work was welcomed with open arms by Owen Harris and Kevin Myers, who commented, "Killing Irish people in their native cities is, after all, what all Republicans do." Step forward to Cork, 1921 to 22. Professor Ewan O'Hanlon, it's mentioned quite a lot in this, also described it as brilliant when it appeared in 2010. Now, to be fair to Murphy, there is an awful lot of valuable information in the book, and he did uncover a wealth of connections between incidents and events which had been overlooked by other historians, a point John Borgonovo was quick to acknowledge in an otherwise damning review in History Ireland. Others were nicer, before also giving it the thumbs down. Murphy, another Cork man, does not take criticism well, and responded savagely to any negative review on his website. Meanwhile, completely coincidentally, I had found that two of his murdered Protestants, Eric Olaf and Edward Hawksworth, had not in fact been murdered, and popped him an email which he thanked him for. So far so good. We almost did coffee. Thus, having set out his stall as an expert and very much a disciple of Hart, he submitted a review of Massacre in West Cork, my book, to the Dublin Review of Books in 2014. I found it crass, mean-spirited and nasty, so I replied. When he then questioned my honesty in his response, I blew a gasket. I mean, it seems that's not a bad problem. Trying to dig up the foundations, I thought. So I examined his list of 32 freemasons to see if any could be found. I quickly found 4 or 5, rattled off an article which I published on my website and updated it a couple of times. This eventually prompted a furious response from Murphy in 2017. Unfortunately for him, I was just putting the final touches to a revision of the article which had increased the total found to 16 and published this 7, which suggested that they include some disappearances. Debunking Murphy's theory is all well and good, all very historical, and it only took 8 years, so it's no problem. Like getting everyone to accept that the Earth is not flat these days, these things do take time. But I have a few questions. Which kind of gets the nub of this issue. Who knew about Gerard Murphy's work? And who knew that I had researched and debunked it in 2017? But the huge problem with this like Hart theory is it keeps popping up. In 2020, Irish Examiner columnist Victoria White wrote an article called I Now Know Why My English Grandmother Hated Cork, using Murphy's book as her single source. And it's not as if Victoria is ignorant of this topic. As she points out, her late father, Jack White, authored the excellent Minority Report written in 1975 about Southern Irish Protestantism. In Ireland, of all these places, this is no academic story of critique. This impacts negatively on the present. Her article was unsurprisingly retweeted by loyalists as proof of murderous sectarianism. Bugle Bow, 37 repeats content, all their tricks laid bare, ethnic cleansing, blame on rogue elements, we'll outbreed them with murder. When they talk of a new Ireland, Republicans salivate over doing this plus more in Northern Ireland. And while you might excuse the anonymous comments of Bugle Bow, the fact that he was based on a massive mistake doesn't seem to matter either to him or some of the other retweeters, like food critic Tom Dory of the Irish Times, journalist Nick Clifford, and the West Cork History Festival. And it should, shouldn't it? And so, to conclude, let me attempt to draw all this together, and let's be brutally honest. Without the ability to self-publish or submit articles to non-academic journals, most of the research about Hart, including mine, would never have seen the light of day. The wild and hairy Alban Historical Society were proved right. The guardians of academic integrity simply are not interested. Without the destruction of the internet, Peter Hart's mass exodus theory and his claim that a veil of silence was drawn over the continuing persecution and dispossession of the Protestants of West Cork, as Protestants had become fair game because they were seen as outsiders and enemies, not just by the IRA, but by a large segment of the Roman Catholic population as well, would have remained the orthodoxy. The fact that it was wrong did not seem to matter. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about the base in Ireland, but there was actually something approaching ethnic cleansing, which is here in the north. And this is the base, first of all, because this is tied into the story of the base slightly on the article that I produced for Irish Studies Review. And that article did a deep textual analysis of bias in the work of 3 titans of revisionism. Paul Dew, or Barnum Dew, Stuart Marchis, and David Fitzpatrick and Roy Foster. Okay? And the big argument in this was that, in essence, and it changed with an awful lot of what has been said already, and I'm particularly appreciative of John's term counterinsurgency. That this, in essence, was an historical argument, a consensus, a discourse, a hegemonic worldview, which parroted and echoed the Dublin and London establishments and their reading of the Northern conflict. So what it did was it took Whitehall propaganda from the Troubles and put it in the time machine, it DeLorean if you like, we came on the right through the Troubles, and it transported it back up to the 1950s. And it argued that the British state was a neutral order, good old Blighty, no skin in the game. It argued that the Unionists in the North, the James Craig government, had a dual right to self-determination. That, and you'll hear this all the time, it's called the principle of consent, that essentially there were dual rights to self-determination in Ireland. And then the third sort of point of this toxic triangle, if you like, was that the irrational, the sectarian, and the incredibly violent element in the conflict were the Irish Republicans. So the people who were pledged to a democratic, anti-sectarian republic actually turned out to be anti-democratic and sectarian, and the people who were in charge of the world's largest empire, which was based on massive oppression, economic exploitation, sectarianism, and racism, were enlightened liberals. And that's essentially it. And that there's just some sort of false dichotomy between Ulster Unionist leadership and the British political imperial establishment, when we're actually God, David, Dane, Mulroy, who have in the same nutshell. So that's the big argument. And it goes back to what Barry was saying about this idea of complexity and nuance. You know, from Gary talked about in Vivid Faces, Ralph also said, we're done with ideology in class, now we have to talk about nuance. Right? But nuance ignores, and we've talked about the distinction between the particular and the general. And if you look at this and history of the process, and you look at it, as I say, take a step back and you look at the oil in the Grand Master instead of pressure and nose up against it, you'll probably agree with what the late Miriam Daly says. She says that you can be as aware as anyone of the subtleties and complexities of Irish as well as all history, but that should not distract you from the blurring structural realities. And these are the structural realities of Irish history and of the revolutionary period. And it fits within the context of imperialism. So you're going to, next year you're going to hear lots about, nationalist myopia and, the anti-democratic position within republicanism, the consolidation of the Free State. And it's as if the British have absolutely, as Liam Mallow said, it wasn't the will of the people, it was the fear of the people. Or as Shashi Tharoor says about the Indian example, he says, and we're going to maybe use this here, a bit of critical distance away from attacking nationalism, to an extent, says, when he talks about Indians who helped the British, he says, many ordinary Indians who went along with the British, many never felt they had a choice in the matter. But when a marauder destroys your house and takes away your cash and jewellery, his responsibilities for his actions far exceeds that of the servant who opened the door for him, whether out of fear, cupidity, or because he simply didn't know any better. So we have to look at the structural realities of this. And I'm going to concentrate, and I'm already 4 minutes into the talk, and I'm going to the last 10 minutes, but I'm going to concentrate on Northern Unionism, the one of the three parts of the triangle. And I look very quickly at what the three titans have to tell us about. And Fitzpatrick comments on Northern Ireland, he says, at its merriest, life in Clongaffin's Ulster was a bowler Hodder's tea party. That's his description of the Orange State, he says, and Few and some other Althusserian Marxists who kind of travelled a long distance from their Marxism, they argue that there is nothing inherently reactionary about a national frontier which was Protestants in the numerical majority. And then they go on to extrapolate or argue that the Unionist leadership ideology is the ideology of Craig, Carson, Dawson Bates, Fred Crawford, although Fred Crawford didn't get the acknowledgement of the centrality of the project that he probably, his historical contribution deserves. He says that the leadership ideology was not primarily orange at all, rather it represented, and these are quotes, a democratic but pro-imperialist secular ideology. This is Ulster Unionism. Okay? Below this level, however, these orange Marxists would give a populist strain within Protestant ideology which the leadership struggled resolutely to control. So there we have it, boys and girls. These poor, unfortunate millionaires, and then on the right side outside, we're going to do it. It's quite preposterous, really. So I'm going to look at two things. I'm going to look at this idea of Ulster and nation. And all three, and this is historical consensus. In fact, this is the political consensus in Ireland at the minute. All three historians promote the theory, and these are quotes again, that there were two nations in Ireland, both with a right to self-determination, although only you has the teleological audacity to call it the principle of consent 100 years. Okay? All three also promote the absurd notion that partition emerged because of nationalist myopia or insensitivity about unions and Protestant concerns. I.e., the chief agents and the people who imposed partition on Ireland aren't actually responsible for partition. In fact, the victims become the aggressors. And if we look at this then, we actually look at the historical record, and this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the discrepancy between what is being argued and what has become essentially the dominant discourse and position within Irish historiography, and what the historical record actually tells us. This is the inversion of history. We've been down the rabbit hole. This is curator and curator. We've actually inverted what the historical record has told us. We've come out with a completely concrete conclusion that any honest person who views the evidence would suggest. So, Unionists, if you read their historical record, Unionists viewed Northern Ireland as an impregnable Protestant and Unionist field. These are the words of James Craig, these are echoed again in private correspondence with the Unionists and the Ulster Unionist Council, that Northern Ireland was going to operate as a bridgehead for the reconquest of Ireland. This idea that somehow partition was about dual rights for self-determination is made a rubbish of really by the fact that Cormac Greenwood congratulates James Craig on the formation of Northern Parliament by saying he's made strong a cement empire. Whenever Michael Collins bombs the Four Forts with artillery against from the British, I don't know why they did that, James Craig receives a letter from Churchill which says, "You can sleep sound tonight now that Collins has drawn the sword against the enemies of the British Empire." This is a discourse which decontextualises the British state and its elite and their agency within global and imperial politics. And it's no coincidence that this reflects a discourse which many of these historians perhaps share in the contemporary movement, where neoliberalism and globalisation, as someone from around this neck of the woods might have said one time, imperialism, it hasn't gone away yet. Okay, it's just a different historical variant on a similar theme, and there's a definite connection between this. But this concept of self-determination is made a rubbish of when you look at what these unionist leaders say publicly and privately. So Carson says in the reading of the Government of Ireland Act, and I'll read this out, he talks against the use of sham phrases like self-determination, for nobody proposes to give self-determination. Okay? He proceeded to mock other ridiculous phraseology such as Woodrow Wilson's "make the word safe for democracy," which he dismissed as making the word safe for hypocrisy. Within the imperialist mindset, self-determination provided, and this is a quote, "a lever to your enemies by which they may, under the guise of constitutional law, attain results which you know in your hearts will be absolutely fatal to the whole empire." End quote. Indeed, Carson rejected the one, never mind the two-nation theory. He tells Parliament there never was an Irish nation. And if you look at the private correspondence, you will see that self-determination was adopted by the Unionist leadership to defeat what they call the pernicious concept of Ireland as a nation. So Carson writes, and despite his crocodile tears in the House of Lords after signing the treaty, Carson writes in his direction to the Ulster Unionist Council in 1919 that if a home rule parliament is to be delivered for the south of Ireland, we must ask for one in the north of Ireland, and we're going to cynically employ the argument of self-determination in order to justify this opinion or this position, but in effect we're doing this in order to subvert the self-determination of the Irish people. So in a letter to Hugh Van Montgomery, who's the leader of, or one of the leading delegates at the Lord Londonderry in the Irish Convention and leading member of the Ulster Unionist Council, Montgomery claimed that strong as the British argument as regards the safety of the realm appears to me to be, the only way to attack the position with success at present is to hold the right of the North East to self-determination for all its worth. He made it clear that this would knock the bottom out of, quote, the dangerous notion of Ireland a nation, as no home rule could be made permanently without Ulster. Elsewhere, he excused, quote, this selfish-looking policy in order to command any popular sympathy in Great Britain, as all sorts of people must be convinced by all sorts of arguments. If we could not save the whole country as long as any fraction of the country was held, if only an equal salient, the country was not all lost. And then Joseph Fisher, who subsequently the non-official unionist delegate to the Browning Commission, says that the argument of self-determination is used as reductio ad absurdum. We never believed in it, but practical political considerations mean that it's now useful to us. So, this idea about due right to self-determination isn't backed up by the historical argument. What we should look at very briefly is this idea about secular, progressive, and democratic type of unionism. Okay? So, again, very briefly, Foster consistently portrays unionism as a relatively progressive, essentially liberal doctrine, especially in comparison to Southern backwardness, near actually characterized Catholicism. Fitzpatrick, and we look at this briefly, takes a different track, but with much the same result, tending to rehabilitate Orangism, despite sparing little detail in cataloguing the insouciance of prudent unionist discrimination. Fitzpatrick qualifies his commentary by pointing out how the still loftier glow of liberalism softened the rhetoric of Lord Londonderry. That's Lord Londonderry, who wrote the Burgess Garden, he was Hitler, and not that great liberal. Apparently Londonderry was a liberal member of the first London cabinet, was a coal miner from Durham. You read his private correspondence, and he basically tells his private correspondence, including Lynn, the editor of the Northern Whig, that he's essentially over in Ireland to secure the peace of the Empire, and he can't wait to get back to England. This is his mission. He says, I hate Belfast, I hate these people, but I really want to go here, sort this out, secure Ireland the Empire, and then I'll return to real politics. The next thing is similarly from this skewed perspective, and this is positive Brooks' opinion about the case. He says Fitzpatrick calls Brooks' shrill admonitions, not an opinion about the case, also demonstrated the persistent influence of more liberal practices in public and private employment. So when the future Prime Minister of the North tells people that an orange parade in the 12, not the white Catholics, the perhaps only Protestant lads and Nazis, Fitzpatrick says that this is actually evidence that there is no discrimination. So, apparently, if Ulster Protestants were really turning a diehard of nationalist imaginations, then why would unionist leaders need to condone them with such public bigotry? That's kind of the argument. The Ulster Unionist Labour Association, and I'm conscious of the time, I don't want to go on too much. Fitzpatrick calls it the Ulster Unionist Labour Association is the hardest expression of proletarian grievance. And I'm going to maybe dwell on this for the last couple of minutes. The Ulster Unionist Labour Association is a body that set up by Edward Carson in 1918, which is based on a blueprint of the British Workers' League, which is a pro-fascist organisation set up by Alfred Lord Milner, the guy in the Ulster Defence League vows to save the white settler colony of Ulster from immersion in the sea of inferior Celts. Him and Walter Long, the guy actually in the country. The British Workers' League is a pro-fascist organisation. Carson, in the New Democratic Age after representation of the People's Act, views the labour issue and control of the class and working class as key. He sets up the Ulster Unionist Labour Association in order to try and safeguard union support within the working class, which is fracturing in a brief period with unprecedented economic, social and political conditions at the end of the First World War and just prior to the Depression in 1920, after the First World War, when a anti-sectarian form of trade unions and socialism is making massive progress in Belfast and across East Ulster. And you only need to look at the urban district council elections in January 1920 to see how Catholics and Protestants, typically unskilled, the rich of the earth, the Front Fund would call them, vote these Labour, anti-sectarian Labour politicians in. If you look at this argument about self-determination and the weightings of numbers, okay, the results from January 1920 would suggest that unionist hegemony is not very secure. The Ulster Unionist Labour Association are employed in order to reassert unionist hegemony in the period of an approaching and imminent economic depression to cleanse the main centres of industry, not only of Roman Catholics, but of Protestant socialists, or rotten Protestants as they're called. And there is good documentary evidence that this Ulster Unionist Labour Association, which is founded by Carson, is chaired by Malone and future Prime Minister Andrews, and is under the control of Dawson Bates, the future Minister for Home Affairs, Secretary of the Ulster Unionist Council. They organised the conference after the return to work, after the 12 holidays, and there's evidence in their minutes of the organisation that they meet Carson 2 days before his speech in Trinity. Carson then gives his famous speech linking Labour and Republicanism, and I care now for words without action. They then organised the pogroms. They organised the expulsion. Now this expulsion has already been touched on. We're talking about 10,000 people are expelled from their work. Okay? After the assassination of Oswald Swansea in Lisbon on the 22nd of August, the entire nationalist population of the town are expelled from their homes. Okay? The logic behind this is that there will be complete unionist control over employment in an economic depression, which will reinforce political control. If you want to have a job in this economic depression, you cannot oppose postal unionism. The economic foundation of what we would call the Orange State within the Republican and Nationalist discourse is laid in the summer of 1920. They introduced vigilance committees, they control the industrial centres in Belfast. What does the British state, the imperial state, do with these pogromists? It gives them part-time employment in the B specialists and the unemployed ex-servicemen into full-time employment in the A specialists, which are founded in September 1920, a month after the burnings of Lisbon, and they're funded for something 2 years to the tune of £6 million during the economic depression. I.e., right, the notion, when we go back to the notion, that somehow the Ulster Unionist leadership, the imperial elite, of which Carson is the linchpin, is the dominant personality really during the Second World War. And the thing here is that, and I quote a bit of Rousseau, I like Rousseau. Rousseau famously remarked, falsehood is out today about, you know, how did they get away with it? I don't think the Revisionists actually ever got away with it. I think that this, for at least the last 30 years, or as long as I've been conscious of history as a thing, history and academic history has been employed to a large extent as a form of propaganda, which is suited with political establishment and with the academy as an extension of the political establishment. But fortunately, it doesn't appear to have permeated the popular consciousness. And the reason why it hasn't permeated the popular consciousness is that it doesn't make sense. That if I got maybe your who's coming into P4 in here to read this evidence and to look at what actually happened, she would tell you that the revisionists are cooking the books, so to speak.
I like the most connected to the right thing, but let's get into that.
Okay, first, one of the things to me, this is interesting, is obviously you talked about this historiography there. It's interesting how and for you see in politics today, and it's interesting listening to you as well, but that analysis won't make it on the UTV Live's political analysis, or it won't make it on the RTE's political analysis. We won't hear that in terms of contemporary pop. How do you move the stuff that you're presenting today into the political mainstream so that the historical record as well as the contemporary record is reflecting these arguments? Because we watch, like, even Phoenix is the classic example where he does peace in the Irish News and stuff like that. But there is this analysis has been presented, and how do we get that out there?
Well, I think this, we're trying our best. I think the way, John, you want to go in there? I think that the way that ideology operates is that there's a number of windows. There's an acceptable level of discourse, there's acceptable things that you can say, maybe in the state meeting, but an expert journalism here should probably be talking about this a lot more than me. But, and flexibility and flux within the popular discourse, and there's movement there, and there's going to be a debate in Ireland now in the next decade about what the future of the country is going to be. So the important thing about this, I think, is, you know, Thomas Clark's dad said that when he was young, she'll never defeat the British Empire, banging your head off a brick. All Thomas Clark says, just keep banging until the thing falls down. Never give up. So if you think you have any integrity about it as a scholar, you have the interest of ordinary people and working class people, from my perspective at heart, then you know, you do everything that you can within your skill set in order to try and promote a narrative that you think better reflects historical reality and perhaps has I would say a more humanist reading on history itself. But it takes more than a handful of individuals to do this. This is something where the exposition of the faults and the defects within this discourse is just a step towards people being able to accept them and use them. And that's why you have an event like this. That's why people come together and say, look, there's some growing body of evidence now that the major mainstream discourse of the Irish Revolution is fundamentally flawed and needs to be reassessed. And way like this out and finding a really important point about there are areas and avenues now outside traditional media and the mainstream media which allow this type of these type of opinions to flourish and for people to connect and networks to be created. So it would be very good if we did get our 1 hour documentary on prime time television. I suggest we might get a commission to PGR, we might get a commission anywhere else. But yeah, but there are ways and means. Muhammad will come to the mountain, might have to come to Muhammad, so you have to try and do it together. But I think Neil would have really insightful things to say about this.
Yeah, I mean, there are limits in terms of what you can and can't say. There's always a consensus in society, and that consensus is restricted. But you can break into it. And I think the effort to critique Peter Hart's analysis and David Fitzpatrick's and the other elements of the revisionist critique has had a degree of success. This is kind of subaltern history. It's breaking in from the outside. Some of the stories are on the inside, but they are not accepted as part of the establishment and there's an attempt to marginalise them. So, but in that context, what the revisionists are doing is they're making history politics. We are accused of criticizing history, but they are the ones who write the history the way they do because they know it is political and they know that history has resonance in society. And Barry brought up the attempt to commemorate the RIC, and of course that blew up in Charlie Family's hands because people immediately said the Black and Tans. And popularly out there, people know about the Black and Tans and actually know more about the history of the war and events because they have access to more sources of information. And this is decried by academic historians. So that people are getting, they're more or less equated with Donald Trump type fake news. But in fact, there's a great deal of objective information out there. A lot of source information is digitized. The Bureau of Military History, the pension claims and so on. And all of that is grist to the mill for ordinary people to actually access what's going on. And for those of us who are actually working on history as a specialised area, it's our job essentially to draw out what we believe to be the important aspects. It is part of the debate, and it's our job to force our way into the debate as best we can. It's not easy, it's difficult, but we do have, I think, on our side the fact that, I know this is a contested term, we are, in a sense, more objective about reality and about the facts. And I think it may have been Benjamin who said that facts are revolutionary things. And why wouldn't they? Because what the facts demonstrate is that revisionist historians essentially leave them out, manipulate them, and assemble the situation with a false picture. So what we're essentially doing is showing that we're taking that picture and we are providing what we would think is a proper perspective. Farrell talked about looking at the picture as a whole, and that's what we're trying to do.
It's been a long time when I sat in A-level history. But when I sat in A-level history, there was only certain texts to be read, and they were revisionist. Although I didn't realise at the time, I just regurgitated what I was given. But in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, I'm delighted that I support historians like this come together and actually tell others on Facebook or whatever how, the right side of history, the side that I totally believe in, the side we accept and give the facts, because it was never given to us before. All the time it was always IRA bodies, Free Steelers goodies, and that was it, basically. We weren't told the truth about Captain James, we were never told the truth even about Michael Collins, who I would have one or two doubts about, but we weren't told the truth about these people at all. They were all good guys. Cattle Brew was a body. That's all that we know. People can make their own decisions, and there's plenty to read. You can make your own mind up.
Oh,
our main broadcaster a few weeks ago, when they ran a programme for a week, the news, on the speeches of the King when he came here in 21. A mother great occasion, and the Inuit Phoenix was given us the history of it. Eamon also wrote a column in the Irish News, but he writes it each morning. And he wrote this column, and he pointed out at the time that these speeches were given by the King, Conley Street, Cooper Street, and all the streets were being burnt out at the same time by loyalists. These are the same streets that were burnt out in '69 as well. But yet the BBC can't have a balance. None of them really can have a balance. It's never loyalist violence. Never loyalist violence, you know. And even in 1969, on the 50th anniversary, the BBC ran a week's documentary, and they interviewed loyalists who were interviewed and told that they were burnt out, which is untrue. You know. So it's not only academics, historians take on. You're actually challenging the media as well. You know.
And of course, the historians should be challenging that, but they're the ones who are effectively supporting it. I mean, I'm struck by the expulsions from 2020 to 2022. In fact, thousands of people lost their jobs over the course of a couple of weeks, expelled from their work, including trade unionists referred to as Rotten Plods. And that is a major seismic event. It's essentially not really commented upon. And you find in the academic discussion they'll say, was it a program? Maybe not. Probably wasn't. Tomatoes, banana. Okay, let's talk about something else. Essentially.
Yeah, I think that's the term myopia is being used against people who don't follow the discourse, but there's lots of blind spot in the way that the Irish Revolution is typically online portrayed and explained, in that nowhere else in Ireland do you have that level of organised expulsion based on ethnic identity. And you use the word ethnic identity because in their speeches they use it as a basis paradigm in order to describe that. And this happens in Clonbridge, it happens in Dromore, it happens in Lisburn, and it happens along the interface in Belfast and then on the islands of Celtic population in the east of the city in particular. And so the level of organised violence is unprecedented outside the reprisal acts carried out by the Crown forces in parts of Southern Ireland. But the big difference here is that it's local people doing it on local people. And most of the West Constabulary commander, someone called Ambrose St. Quentin Ricardo, he delivered a secret report to a British civil servant, Stephen Thomas, who came over to investigate the events in Ulster. Now, nothing happened to his report because Michael Collins threw the sword against the enemies of the British Empire in the meantime, so the northern issues buried. But Ricardo says that these people are creating blood feuds that will last a generation. The black man will leave, and we will already talk the British military guards will leave Ireland to a large extent. This is the legacy of the revolutionary period in the north, and it's a period where in Britain, England and Wales there's 650 police for every person. In Scotland there's 700, and in the north there's 140 people for every police person. And the police is directed against one third of the population for the most part, and you've got extraordinary legislation brought in the Special Powers Act. This is occluded, it's not really mentioned much. It's as if, Pogrom, what is this specific ontological meaning? I feel like, soft rock, a cherry tree, but is this a cherry tree or is this, no, it doesn't fit the grave of a Pogrom question. And Robert Lynch in the BBC documentary goes, but by the way, the Belfast White Fox racist, he calls it racist. And you're going, this is a non-violent response to perhaps one of the most exceptionally violent and premeditated and organised pieces of sectarian or ethnic violence in the revolutionary period. It's, it's a possibility.
To go back to the original question, how do you address this? We have modest resources available to us as individuals. But what we're all doing is that we're demonstrating the confusion on the page. And we're demonstrating that there is something different between scholarly historical writing on what the historians are doing. And what the historians are doing, we call this in the Academy invented history. That is to say, you take a narrative, you ransack the archive until you find evidence to back up that narrative. If you can't find the evidence, make it up. Then, publish it in a book printed by Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press. They won't appreciate you laughing at this, you know, because they're doing it in good faith for the most part.
Yeah.
Manchester University Press and so forth. Because it's being peer reviewed by historians that are steering the narrative. And what we're doing is we're pointing out the confusion on the page. Now, some people say use the word deception. I won't use that word. It's confusion on the page. Because when you read or pick up a book by Oxford University Press written by a historian or one of our great universities, the expectation is that there's some scholarly integrity working into it. The information has a validity. What the information has is a message, a piece of message attaching certain values to an ideology which is seen as being pernicious. I talked about a counterinsurgency historiography, but my history serves me correctly. The insurgency ended nearly 25 years ago here. But what has happened is that what happened in the 80s and 90s, the counterinsurgency historiography took hold, and now it controls the manufacture of historical information in Ireland. Now, not every historian subscribes to this, but most have to. The integral, fundamental component of invented history, it's a history that is directed. It's a history connected to the establishment, both media, political, and the academic establishments. But what drives it is coercion, force. Now you might say, how could that happen within a liberal academy? How can force work its way out? Well, you're applying for a job, you're on the wrong narrative, no chance that you finish your PhD, or you're applying for a grant, you're not on message, no chance. Or you'll be sidelined out of your job and out of your career. Such things have happened not very far away from here in my career. So coercion is a component of this. You're not on message, you're out. So the very function of the invented history that we're describing is illiberal, anti-intellectual, and non-scholarly. And yet it is propped up because there's a vested interest in it.
Could I go further than that and say, we're students of, many of us are students of the history department, right? You're punished if you don't buy their line. You're punished by the marking system. If you don't buy what they tell you to write in your work, you're punished by the marking.
Well, that's possible. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah. Could I just address the whole question of how do we actually break through all this? Well, one of the greatest things that happened, obviously, with the internet, is the democratization of the archive. So, for example, you can read a newspaper report from anywhere in Ireland or the United Kingdom in the safety of your own home late at night while minding a young child or something like that. And you can literally go, there's that page. And if we're searching for a small, that's a great resource to have, first of all. We also have the democratization of the Bureau of Military History, the military service pensions, and all of these things. And on the other side, which is important because we must remember, anything we're talking about, the side that normally gets the left out is the British government. On the British government side, the National Archives in the UK have published every single one of the cabinet minutes and the cabinet reports right through the entire period, right? And it's online and pretty much it's free to access. It's no big deal. So, for example, when it comes to the creation of Northern Ireland, remember, even before the Boundary Commission is being waved in front of Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith saying, oh look, we'll give you back all these bits, there's a British government cabinet meeting in Inverness, because Lloyd George was up in Inverness with his mistress at the time, and they all trundled up to Inverness, and they all trundled up to Inverness, get the train, and they're all bitching about the fact that they're going to Inverness and so on, and it's held in the town hall in Inverness, and the minutes of that clearly state that under no circumstances are are the two counties of Tyrone and Fermanagh going to be allowed out of Northern Ireland. It's black and white. So even before poor old Collins and Griffith were going in signing the treaty, they were already being told to start. Right? And the critical thing about well, it's fair. But the critical thing about this is that Collins and Griffith could never have signed the treaty if they knew that piece of information. It's in the minutes, you can read it, it's all there. So already, when you look at the democratisation of it, I can say, look, it's there, right? You can go and check, you can go home and see it and check and so on, right? And one of the things that I've been extremely careful in doing, I think John will probably agree, is that every single thing I find, I reference and I say, look, if you don't believe me, you will find it there, right? And I think that's the critical thing. The reason that I was able to, shall we say, lob a historical grenade in the top of Peter Hart's research about his Protestant population decline was I had the information, I presented the information, and I didn't say, I'm right, you're wrong. I said, make up your own mind. And in fairness to David Fitzpatrick, he jumped ship, right? I think one of the most shocking days I ever had was reading The Spectre of Protestant Extermination in his article, because we all kind of, he was doing his article in Cambridge, whatever, and we all, as it was coming out, and we were all going, oh, here we go again. And we all read it, and there was emails flying back and forth going, have you read this? You know, so suddenly, here is David Fitzpatrick, Peter Hart's supervisor, going, actually, yeah, Peter was wrong, even though he doesn't mention it like it. And he was forced to do that by myself and by lots of other people going, the sums don't add up. The emperor has no clothes. And when the emperor has no clothes, a good academic, and let's be honest, David Fitzpatrick was a very good academic, sometimes has to go, okay, hands up, we're over. And that's how you do it. You have to force people into changing their position simply by the weight of evidence. But it must be verifiable, provable, referenceable, sourceable. So if you do that, then you're fine.
How do you explain this article in English Historical Review, published by Rick Coleman, which verifies statistics and says something very similar to what happened in Cork?
Well, I can't. I did actually come across by accident a document that said that there was kind of an attack on Protestants in Ballinleen, which is what she suggests, in 1922. But the reality is, when you look at it, and you look at the sums of this again, in Longford, in 1911, which is the baseline, you find that the Ordnance Survey, the UK Ordnance Survey, are actually doing mapping County Longford, and an awful lot of them are Church of England and their families are there and so on. And if you then go and work your way through the census, you find that in the others there's another 28 lying around doing nothing. And when you take them out of the statistics, then her sudden dramatic loss in the 20s becomes a lot less. Now, just on that issue, I've just finished a bit of research in Dunleary, which is of course the centre of the 22 massacres, and I think John will probably agree that I'm probably one of the biggest nerds on the planet. But I went through the 203 Protestants in Dunleary who were recorded in the census in 1911 and found out where they all ended up, right? And so I found 160. Now the rest I couldn't really deal with because they were Kingstons and Sullivans. So there's an awful lot of them, and they're all called John or Mary or Patrick. Right? So of my 160, 17 were directly impacted by the Dunleary massacre. Right? So there's nothing happens on the 22, then there's 17 disappear, and then there's nothing happens after that in terms of people leaving and moving and getting married and so on. So it's just literally 1 week in 22, and that's it. And of that 17, one is the Jago family, I'm sure you remember, who are Methodist, and there's 8 of them, and they go to camp. So literally, you're talking about 3 families in this round zero of the 22 murders leave the town. And all the rest stay. All the rest are still there. Even the grandson of one of the guys who was involved in the massacre lives in the same house that his father was shot. Or sorry, his grandfather was shot. His father was being shot as well. And instead of owning 80 acres like his grandfather did, he now owns 300 acres because his cousins and all passed away and bequeathed to him. And I sat one day many years ago in a town called Kilbarry, and I asked the guy, I said to him, tell me how many Protestant farmers live around you. And he went around in a circle. And I think we around his house of 35. So the reality is, when you go looking, nobody really left. The farmers are still there. They left for normal economic, sensible reasons that people left the west and south of Ireland because they had better jobs elsewhere. Right? And that's the reality. So how in the hell Peter Hart, researching in exactly the same area I had done my master's research in, came up with his theory and he got it published, is the problem. And that question has never, ever been answered. And that's the question that is rotten at the centre of all of this. And if they don't, if the people who were the guardians of peer review, which is what they were, don't stand up and answer that question, then that cancer will continue at the centre of our issues. That's the problem. That's why we stand up and say, come on, you've got to actually deal with this, and they haven't. So that's where we're coming from, I think, and I think it's an extremely important point to say that it's all been
You're living expectation of a scholarly debate on an even playing field when you're the opposition people, the gatekeepers, the people that are fostering this kind of history are not engaging in a scholarly discussion or debate. And they're not behaving in the way that one would expect within a liberal academy.
I'd be interested to ask you just my personal experience, what impact your challenge to this narrative has had on your lives and your own careers? Because I know obviously, I know my mate Fergal here has went for 1,000 jobs in Queen's. He's never got any of them, and I wouldn't give him a job in Queen's today. But the point of it is I can remember, like Fergal going to Queen's, you quickly realised, coming from a Republican background, that you were in a state of struggle. That this wasn't a mess about. This was it. This is what you were seeing in the streets here. Was being played out in the corridors of lecture halls. I remember when I was the first year, we had Peter Hart, and we had another guy called Barden, Jonathan Barden. And one of the first talks that we went to, he was doing a talk about the 80s. We had along this, and he was saying when the IRA brutally murdered the three IRA bombers on a murder mission were executed by the SAS at their funeral. They were at their funeral. He was getting his notes now out here. At their funeral, they murdered 2 British Army corporals, and everybody's getting a pen out. Excuse me, Michael Stone. There's a guy called Michael Stone. I was there. I was 7. Michael Stone. This is my first lecture. I mean, going, Jesus Christ, this is a racket. But the point of it was is what we learned then is the modules at that time were called A Century of Change and Reconciliation. That was a terminology that they were using. This is in the aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement. So the discourse that was being painted of a new Northern Ireland was being meted out through this history. So it was, as you were saying, John, it was constructed, it was limited. So you and this is of course the narrative that Fergal has talked about, which is there to the present day. And what we're trying to do with spaces like this is to excavate the subaltern, is the hidden histories that aren't there to get in space. But as you were saying about the stuff about the RIC, popular narratives don't buy it. People don't buy it. People don't buy the end of history. So I would just be interested in finding out how it has impacted on yourselves, having the courage to actually tell the truth. Because telling the truth, as you were saying, John, in academia will mean that you won't get a job, will mean that you'll be held back, and how do we challenge that?
Well, first of all, once you're starting outside of consensus, you are, it's a jagged path, it's a difficult path to take, and you need to understand that that's what you're doing. It's far easier to adopt the role of keeping your head down, not challenging too much, and for those who weren't there in 1988, they will just take on board, they will scribble down what they're being told. But it's very hard to teach people history who actually participated in the events that you're describing. So in other words, you were there and you were in a position to contradict. It's very hard to teach history to people in the north of Ireland for whom history is just politics in retrospect. History is something that you live every day because you know that what's happening politically is going to become part of a broader narrative, a contested narrative. Now, as John said, not every historian adopts the kind of methodology that we're critiquing here. And a lot of the historians who do adopt methodology aren't consciously deciding to twist the facts. They're subject to an ideological view. So you're going to constantly be subject to this idea that the IRA sectarian was sectarian, because they think a lot of historians think they were, and so they will find something that looks like proof of that, and they will write about it. And what's necessary then is to critique it. And what will be important in the final analysis is when students who don't feel subdued by the power of the market, who are in a position to challenge on a broader basis the type of history that they're being taught. That will probably depend, like the 1960s, on a broader political movement of some kind, because it won't happen particularly in the universities. But the university will be part of it as centres of ideological discussion, thought, supposedly. And maintaining a control of history can only be successful to a certain degree. And it has been successful to a certain degree, but it has been largely unsuccessful, as Virgil said in relation to popular consciousness. It was successful in the context of training people who are working within the establishment or who are involved in processes of controlling people, in management, employment, and so on. It's essentially training for people in those types of positions. But it's not overtly taught in that way. It's taught in the context of here's information, it's interesting information, you're excited about it, let's find out what happened. That's what you're told officially is happening, but you find out that's not what's delivered. So, because life is contradictory, so all of these things will continually be subject to discussion, debate, and critique. And it's important that back to these meetings that not everybody has grey hair. So it's important that there are a number of people coming through and that they take up the baton.
Anybody else want to come up? Emerson?
It's been great for my career to quite honest. I'm a member of the Academy and I've had 2 books published and they sold out. So I ended up being able to buy him a nice cup of coffee or 2. And things like that. And one of the things that does happen is I do get loads and loads of comments and stuff, particularly off academia and my website, with people that ask other questions and so on. And you know, so there's a narrative going back and forth. So I've done well over it, but I guarantee you, if I was in a university looking for a job, I didn't think anybody would employ me. So that's just the reality of it.
There are positives and negatives. Some of the negatives I will talk about more over a pint today.
I'd probably just like to finish by saying that like having Virgil as a history teacher who showed us the revisionist history and told us his own truth of that history, gave us the choice to say what side of history we were going to agree with and what side of history we were going to obey by and tell. And there was 8 people in our class, and he had that effect on 8 people, 8 people who went on to university. And when I write an essay in university, I often get my essay being torn apart constantly. And there's been a couple of times where I've been like to my dad, here, I just go and decide that they told me to write. But the problem is, I don't know how to, because I've been taught to be honest and to be open and to be critical, and I don't know how to do what they tell me to do. And sometimes it's like, it would just be easier, but it's not. And I've had to learn that, yeah, they're going to be critical of you, and you're going to get hard marks, and you might do it as well. But you've no choice but to learn from that and actually develop your own analysis and your own facts and make your work more accurate. And it probably works counterproductively to produce better historians who can tell the history more honestly. And yeah, okay.
Remember when I was on the Angela Davis lecture in Belfast at the City Hall?
Yeah.
On Wednesday, we were preparing for the adult, and I said, no, it's International Women's Day. They threw the said, let's watch Angela Davis. And I know the mural outside the classroom, but I think that the big thing is, it's not even that a lot of our historians are armed with a thesis. They're armed with a predisposed, preconditioned idea of what they want to find. If you're armed with a thesis, that's good. If you want synthesis and you challenge it and you see, yeah, that's all part of the academic process, that's part of the scientific process, and you come up with a synthesis. A lot of what appeared to happen was this historical, this invented history was reduced, and a lot of people But if you want to get ahead, you need to prove this stuff.
Exactly right.
And there's a lot of it. And there's an open door, and you know, if you and it becomes a sort of argument chamber.
People want nice houses.
Yeah.
They want better kitchens.
What's this? And I remember going and doing the research on Tyrone, and even like subconsciously going, this is going to be an awful kind of conflict here. It's going to be terrible. You know, usually antagonistic, warning trades. And then I looked at it and went, shit, this isn't actually what's happening. You know, but I, even someone who was critical, not an awful lot honest, still get, you know, even Humphrey writes in that great essay about all that inside the wheel. When you're inside the wheel, it's there's enormous psychological pressure, and the parameters of actually what you can think are affected, and it's you know, it takes something to be able to perhaps deprogram yourself, break away from it.
Let's be in no confusion about this. That this history, this historiography, the counterinsurgency historiography, has been created against your community. The nationalists and Republicans of Northern Ireland and of this part of the world in particular. It's a counterinsurgency directed at you. So if you're from this community, there should be no confusion or doubt. Like why you disagree with what's been given in the lecture theatre or what's been presented to you. That somebody would mark you down for disagreeing with you is an appalling thing to happen. It does happen. So if you think about Anglo-Irish relations over the last 400 years, the British and British Empire had an interest in Ireland, which was effectively a military strategic interest, which you kind of referenced at the very end of your talk, which was to secure Ireland in order to secure Britain, England's defence interest, to avoid the possibility of a dual invasion from continental Europe and from Ireland at the same time, because over the years the Spanish, the French, and the Germans in 1916, and certainly again in 1939 and 1940, had an interest in Ireland. And a dual invasion from continental Europe and from Ireland was a strategic interest. Remember, it's only 16 miles from the Mull of Kintyre to the Northampton coast. Campbelltown, it's a very short distance by a boat, far nearer than the Channel. So the reason the Northern Ireland state is created is to protect that strategic interest, which may or may not exist to this day. I don't know, that's an open question. It'll come into view. And in a sense, the history has been created in order, from the Southern perspective, to maintain the stability of the border, from the Unionist position to maintain Unionist hegemony in Northern Ireland, and from the British interest to maintain the possibility that if there ever was a crisis in the future, the British would be in a position to take an island to Ireland in good time. And it's that strategic interest, and this is my take on it, which largely defines the historiography, and it has meant that strategic interest means that our lives on this island have been organised in the British interest for hundreds of years. But more sharply, that describes the lives of people who lived here since 1969. Your society was uprooted, turned on its head, in order that the British strategic interest here would continue. And that explains part of your history. But I don't think you'll find that in the lecture notes.
No, and that leads on to the fact that the border itself, the 6 counties and the 6 counties, the border in the north failed miserably, and the border in the south worked tremendously well. Would you accept that? And the fact that we're all Nordies, you know, Nordies are also.
I think there's a point of making that after the war of independence, the southern state was consolidated on essentially a counter-revolutionary basis, but an analysis that John Wood originally, the Irish counter-revolution. Yes, that is true. But a point I would also make in relation to the difference between North and South is that southern society is a capable community in the sense that it exercises self-determination to a degree, and the state and the community is capable of change. That is impossible. The northern society is created as a sectarian state. All its structures identify that. That's why politics is so peculiar here. That's why there's so many regulations with regard to what happens when you vote for people when they go to the assembly. The state constitutes sectarianism. It's a means of originally maintaining ascendancy and maintaining superiority of one community over another. In order to end that, normal democracy had to end in their own, as we understand. So the political arrangements had to come in and they make it impossible to discriminate against people on the basis of various laws and so on. So not to say it doesn't happen, but it doesn't change at all the attitudes people have. So that's why the North is a failure in itself, in and of itself. That's why United Ireland would probably be a good thing, in the sense that it would free people from the way they're locked in to their positions. If you look at Southern State, it was set up with the dominant Protestant bourgeoisie, the dominant Catholic Church engaged in social control of mainly the Catholic population. That was eroded over time. The Catholic Church plays the role it had, given to it by the British government in the 19th century and then the Southern State in the 20th century. So things change in the South. They remain static in the North. So in that sense, if you're talking about good, bad, I think it's a different way than the way you're expressing it. So I think that's essentially what's happened. One of the things about the historiography, what it does is it constitutes a caricature of so-called Catholic nationalism, which people who are nationalist republic are supposed to be a part of. No, I'm not a Catholic nationalist, so anybody else here is one, but we are all supposed to be part of this community, and we're all supposed to be engaged in self-questioning, rather not self-questioning, navel-gazing. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Looking into ourselves and finding our faults. That's the whole basis of the revisionist historiography as well. To see, to get us to decommission our mindsets in order to make us make our understanding of history no longer instrumental, no longer political. Essentially, is what's happened. And I think that's also part of the critique of art is to try and undermine that attempt to social control the population, which is, in terms of popular perception, has been a failure in our sense.
So, Cambridge, how do you sum that? Do you want to say anything?
No, that's great. As we continue to do it in Madness Bar. I don't mean I'm like a card.
I would like to thank the thousands who are here.
Here, I think it's after it's after race.
Very good.
Here.